Hello, you are listening to KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, a podcast where we explore the path to Ireland's exciting energy future. We discuss the practical things that we can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland as a major energy producer. I'm Colm O'Neill, and today I'm joined by Muireann Lynch, who's a Senior Research Officer at the Economic and Social Research Institute, the ESRI. Muireann holds a degree in Mathematics and Economics from Trinity College Dublin and a PhD from the School of Electronic and Electrical Engineering in UCD. She's a funded investigator with MARE and is a Deputy Director of the SFI-funded Nexus Partnership. Along with all of this, Muireann is a respected commentator on all things energy. Good afternoon, Muireann, and thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
It's quite a CV. and before we get anywhere near energy, I have to ask you that during my research, I noted that you are an accomplished choral singer. And so two questions. One is, how do you find the time? And the second is, how does it help you in your life?
How do I find the time? My kids go to bed at 7.
That helps.
I will die on this hill. Yes, it means that they wake up at 6:30, but it's worth it. Yeah. Like having our evenings is worth not getting to sleep in ever.
Yeah.
And how does it affect my life? Yeah, it's great fun. Like there's something amazing about being in a choir. You're not in any way important, and yet you're integral to the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's just about it's the ultimate teamwork.
Yeah.
You always have at least one other person on your line. If you're maybe a second tenor, there might be one other second tenor. As a soprano, I always have a few other people. So if you drop out, that's no issue. But it's about making this beautiful sound all together, and just getting that blend. You're always looking for a blend. You're never looking for one voice to stick out. And
yeah.
It's really, really fun, and it's just time for myself, really. And then we always go for a drink afterwards.
So a bit of social aspect to it as well.
Yeah, in fact, last week, choir rehearsal happened the day that there was a big announcement on the energy side, the results of the energy auction, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, we
but
will.
I raised a glass to the Department of Energy and to EirGrid and to the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, and everyone was like, cheers.
That was a fairly obtuse point for most people, I would have thought.
Yeah, but they were happy to raise the glass.
Them.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm sure you explained the context at the same
I did
time.
Explain the context, yes.
How great an outcome it was.
Yeah.
And we're definitely going to come on to that, but I guess to the first question, energy related, is, the focus of the podcast is, the opportunity that this energy transition presents for Ireland. Other places in the world are going to have to make this transition, and it's going to be very challenging and difficult for them, and there's not a huge amount of upside for them. For us, there's a potential very significant upside, and I just wanted to get your just general thoughts on that whole area of opportunity for Ireland.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that sets energy apart from other goods is it's what we call a pure input good. So no one ever just wants a megawatt hour. No one ever just wants to charge a battery and leave it sitting on their shelf to admire it. No one ever just wants a barrel of oil. We only ever want energy to do something else with it. And Ireland has been a net importer of energy for pretty much always, or at least since industrialisation. And if you look at our share of energy that is imported in comparison to our European neighbours, it's really high.
Yeah.
So I suppose one of the large potential areas of opportunity is to go to, instead of being an importer, to producing and using more of our own energy domestically, and then possibly ultimately to export, depending on how the international picture stacks up.
Yeah.
And what that means is that we have more control, particularly over the price of a key input good. Now, at the moment, we do have an awful lot of export. Like, Ireland is a very open economy. We import an awful lot and we export an awful lot. But everything we've kind of exported so far is kind of like final use goods.
Yeah.
We don't really we don't really export much by way of input goods. So there are challenges associated with that, but there are certainly opportunities as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because energy is fundamental to industry. It's what the industrial revolution has been built on, is ever more denser types of energy, and that opportunity for Ireland isn't just to look after our needs as they exist today, but if we can overproduce energy, we could export it, or we could attract energy intensive industries to base themselves here and build an industrial base like we've never built before.
For sure. So one of the things that we've seen in the last year or so is the impacts that energy prices actually have when they go high, and particularly when they become uncertain. So I would say it all comes down to the price. We're very, very focused on our resource, which is really important. And the fact that we have such a good wind resource in particular is obviously a key ingredient. But I would say that's a necessary but not a sufficient condition in order to be able to export our energy or attract industry here. If we can get the price right, so if we can secure this energy at a price that's sufficiently low and that's sufficiently certain, then yes, we could definitely attract energy intensive industries, particularly electricity intensive industries, where to date that hasn't been our forte at all. But similarly, if we do want to get into the business of exporting energy, it has to be at the right price. We can't expect people to buy super expensive offshore wind or super expensive hydrogen generated from offshore wind off us. It has to be at a price that's attractive and that's competitive internationally.
And maybe that brings us kind of neatly to the auction that you talked about a little bit earlier on, which concluded a short time ago. And I'm going to quote a section of a tweet thread that you issued at the time. Really, I would highly recommend that people look for that tweet thread and read it, because I thought it was a really succinct summary of both what had happened and kind of the implications or read through from it. But one interesting element of it was, you said, "I've been re-examining my biases yesterday and today. I realised that I was resigned to the idea that energy in Ireland will always take way longer and cost way more than it should. I've updated my priors." Can you expand? Yeah,
so I am really into the idea that we all do what's called motivated reasoning. So we have an intuitive reaction to something, and then our conscious brain kicks in and finds reasons to believe what we intuitively reacted to in the first place. And what this means in practice is it's very important that we constantly ask ourselves, what am I getting wrong here? Do I need to update? Is there new information I need to take on board? If you kind of feel like something's true, for me, that's a trigger to question it even more. Yeah. And if you kind of feel like something's not true, that's a trigger to maybe give it a bit more credence than you otherwise should. Mm-hmm. So in that context, sometimes something hits you out of the blue and makes you go, wow, I wasn't expecting this at all. Why wasn't I expecting it? So what happened was we had an auction for offshore renewable energy, the first auction. We've had 2 onshore auctions so far. One of them cleared at a high price. The other one cleared at an even higher price. Okay. And offshore in general costs more than onshore. So I expected it to clear at an even higher price. Yeah. And instead it cleared lower than the latest onshore auction. And that made me go, okay, why did I expect such a high price? Do I have to re-examine my biases here? Mm-hmm. And I realized, you know what, I've been in this game long enough to be kind of resigned to the fact that for whatever reason, we just take ages to do anything, and it costs so much more than our comparator countries. Yeah. And that has made me rethink things. Okay. And if you were to look at the drivers behind that, I guess, surprisingly low price that was paid, what do you think were the drivers there? So a couple of things. First of all, it seems that we changed the rules, we changed some of the conditions to the offshore auction relative to the onshore ones. So we did listen to what industry were telling us. Yeah. So some of the auction price is linked to inflation. So our previous renewable support was called refit, which was 100% linked to inflation in the positive direction only, which was a crazy idea. Yeah. It was way too expensive. Then the 2 RES auctions so far had no inflation indexing, which was probably too far in the other direction. So this latest auction has some portion linked to inflation, which makes sense because some of your costs are going to increase in line with inflation, notably O&M. Yeah. One of the other changes we made was whenever you build a renewable project, there's always a risk that not all the energy will be used, because if the sun shines or the wind blows when demand isn't high enough, it gets wasted. We've decided to compensate wind producers regardless, even if that happens. The reason for that is because we could not compensate for them, but then they're going to bid a higher price. So the consumer ends up bearing the cost either way. And it's just basically which cost should the consumer bear, and they're probably better able to mitigate a cost of or a risk of oversupply than they are able to mitigate really high prices. So both of those things helped. But I think another thing that happened was we had decent competition in this auction. So just under 5,000 megawatts bid into that auction, and just over 3,000 megawatts won contracts. So that means that we had a decent competition in that auction.
Yes.
So we had kind of like about 25% of the energy that bid in didn't win a contract.
Yes.
If you look at the onshore, it's more like 5%.
So really,
now there's a decent chunk of solar that went in that didn't win contracts.
Yeah.
But just within onshore wind itself, it seems that we haven't had enough competition on the onshore auctions to date.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely something else we need to look at going forwards. It turns out that when Irish wind competes with itself, we get good prices.
Yeah. Which and like the not only was there great interest and great competition, but there were really credible competitors in this auction, and it really does give us, I think, hope as we build out our offshore wind resources, that we would hope that I guess prices will continue to fall as people get more confidence and more more surety of projects getting through from where they are now to actual delivery.
I would hope so. So if you look at offshore auctions in other countries, the prices have steadily come down.
Yeah.
So the first auction always has extra risk associated with it because no one knows what's going to happen. No one knows what the environment will look like once you go to actually build. But prices have come down since then. Now, this is Ireland's first offshore auction, so it is clearing at a comparatively high price relative to other countries that have had 2 and 3 and 4 auctions.
Yeah.
But in terms of who won contracts, it included developer companies from France and from Germany and from Norway. So that shows us straight off that there is international interest in the offshore wind sector in Ireland, even though it's completely untested. So these are companies that could go and invest in a mature market. They're willing to take a risk on an industry and an area that is as yet unproven.
Yeah.
But for the next auction and the one after that, if these projects go ahead on schedule, not skipping any planning or regulatory steps, but proceeding through them in a predictable manner, then that actually de-risks future auctions. So there's every reason to think that the price will come down in future auctions, as it has in other markets, assuming we get things right. Yeah.
And it is, so much of these projects and the pricing of them is pricing risk at the right point in the project. And I think, the 2 points that you're making there, the structure of the auction, which took the risk off the developer for the wind being consumed, the energy being consumed, whether it was required or not at a point in time, was a really smart move. But also then that risk disappearing, if we can demonstrate that we're a reliable deliverer of these projects, will be really helpful in the longer term.
Exactly, yeah. So that's still a risk in the first auction,
yes.
But hopefully we can get rid of it for subsequent auctions, which means the price will come down again.
Should come down again. Now, wind, and particularly offshore wind, has been the star of the show for some time, and our energy transition strategy has always been heavily electricity based. Gas over the last 12 to 18 months has definitely started to make a significant kind of return to the playing field, I would say. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a classic example of you never notice it until it's gone. And for the first time ever, we got a taste of how much gas is doing for us.
Yeah. When
the price went really high, and where there was even fear of actual supply interruptions at one point. Now, thankfully, that didn't manifest. I think there's a couple of things about gas that make it very, very useful. So one is the fact that it can store itself. So kind of a gas molecule can store its own energy within itself. The same is not true of electricity.
Yeah.
Electricity, you have to instantaneously use it. Now, whether you use it to pump water up a hill and then let it down subsequently, or to charge a battery, so you can store it that way, but you still have to use it immediately. And it's the fact that gas is that flexible fuel that you don't have to use it, you don't have to manage flows on an ongoing basis. And then also the fact that it is relatively clean compared to like a solid fuel. So for home heating and that kind of thing, it's a great fuel. And then there's also the fact that its price has been fairly predictable until recently.
Yeah.
So now we've been exposed to the dangers of relying too much on any one fuel, and this would go for any other fuel. You're always going to be in trouble if you rely too much on one. So I think it's made us rethink things a little bit. It's made us rethink, first of all, how important gas is in the first place, but secondly, maybe how dangerous it is to rely on it too much. And we are very reliant on gas.
Yeah. So to diversify our fuel type is and particularly if you consider, as we decarbonize Ireland, the shift from oil is actually the big shift that needs to take place, and you then start to realize how much of our current generation capacity is predicated on having reliable access to gas. Now, when you look at gas, lots of different options for us. There's the fossil gas that we already import in fairly significant volumes, and there's the growing biomethane opportunity. There's hydrogen as an option. What are your thinking across those kind of three different options?
Yeah, so I think if we look at our progress in renewable electricity and how successful we've been, and compare it to our progress in, say, renewable heat and renewable transport, there's a huge dichotomy there. Like, we had way higher targets for electricity, for renewable electricity, that we met, and yet we've really struggled to meet the far lower targets in heat and transport. I wonder whether or not that is partly explained by the fact that for electricity, at least to date, the consumer hasn't really had to do anything. Their behaviour has not had to change at all. We continue to use electricity as we always did, and we've just made the fuel renewable. For heat and transport, the plan actually is for consumers to make significant investments and possibly behavioural changes. So invest in a heat pump instead of a fossil fuel based system, invest in an electric car instead of a combustion engine, and change patterns around how we heat our homes, how we travel. I wonder if maybe we're expecting the consumer to do a bit too much. And if it turns out that we are, then what's plan B? Well, plan B is decarbonise the fuel like we did for electricity. So that's where renewable gases could really come into their own. So again, the consumer continues to use their boiler as always. It's just the boiler is burning biomethane and or hydrogen instead of natural gas. That would be a significant policy shift. I'm not sure whether or not it's the right move. I think that's an open question. And the reason I think it's an open question, the reason I'm not 100% sure that we've solved this with the electrifying narrative, is because we need to put a value on that consumer behaviour. Like, is there a consumer barrier? And if so, how big is it? Can we quantify it in terms of money? And then the other question is, what is that value of storage that gas molecules have that electricity megawatt hours don't have? I do think that renewable electricity is going to be a huge part of the story either way. But if we can put a value on the consumer barriers and the storage potential of gas, that might actually stack up a little bit differently in terms of the optimal policy mix. But as far as I'm concerned right now, it's an open question. So
as it currently stands, without being able to quantify some of those variables, it's difficult to make the case one way or the other. But if we start to quantify them and the value of those is higher than we might anticipate at the start, then it could make sense to economically to add that to the mix.
Potentially, yeah.
And I do think the energy transition in general, and not just here in Ireland, it's full of dogmatic positions on things, and I think the ultimate solution is likely to be a lot more nuanced than we currently kind of argue in public on these subjects.
I couldn't agree more. I think the world is a very complicated place. Energy systems are very complicated, and anyone who thinks that they have the right answer is wrong. I don't care what they say the answer is, they're wrong, because we don't have the right answer yet. And whatever the answer is, it's going to be complex, it's going to be nuanced, and it's going to involve trade-offs. So it does bother me when people say, oh, it's a win-win or whatever, because or it's a no-brainer. That's another one that gets to me, because it kind of assumes that the only reason we haven't done it so far is we've got no brain. No, it's far more complicated than that, and there are going to be losers as we transition. We have to face that head on. We have to compensate people appropriately. But the idea that there's nothing but gold at the end of this rainbow is immensely frustrating, because it completely underestimates the challenge that's ahead of us.
The challenge, and as you say, the complexity of getting there. Coming on to another complex subject, you and I spoke on a panel recently, and at that particular event, Minister Oisin Smith gave a bit of a check on one of the previous panels, which had been all male, and at the most recent Energy Ireland conference, actually, we did a panel on women in energy, and it was a really, really good panel. And the main thrust of that came through was, the energy transition is going to take lots and lots of people, lots and lots of skills. Why would we not be trying to maximize the participation of women, and in particular young girls making the decision to get into the industry in whatever way they would choose to get into the industry. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, so speaking of complex and nuanced,
there you go.
Yeah. I think a lot of the time the purported solution so far has been along the lines of, you need to get into schools, you need to get girls interested in maths, you need to get girls interested in engineering.
Yeah.
But if you take a step back from that to me suggests that the solution is we need to convince girls to like what boys like.
Yes.
And we need to convince women to be more like men.
Yeah.
And that bothers me.
Okay.
It bothers me in principle, and it also bothers me in practice, because it won't necessarily work.
Yeah.
I think if you look at some data from the Growing Up in Ireland's study, where primary and secondary caregivers were surveyed, the vast majority of primary caregivers are women.
Yeah.
And they're asked, how many hours would you like to work? Mm-hmm. It's a massive distribution. There are some women who want to work no hours. There are some women who want to work essentially full-time, 35, 40 hours.
Yeah.
But it's all sorts of values taken in between, and it peaks at 20.
Yes.
So what the data is showing us is that all else equal, zero constraints, women want flexibility. So that panel that was on last Friday, I wasn't able to attend because I don't work Fridays, because I've got 3 small kids and I take Fridays off. And that is fantastic. It really contributes to our work-life balance, and the difference it makes to our family life is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then my husband works fewer hours than me as well, and he does the afternoons. So I think the way forward might be if we can pitch the energy industry as a family-friendly industry, as one where men as well as women are encouraged to take family leave, as one where flexible schedules are standard, and as one where we recognise that as a species we reproduce, and we like to take time not just with our children but also with our hobbies, with things outside of work. That could go an awful long way to attracting women into the sector, particularly if we can get a reputation in that area. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't also encourage STEM subjects. We shouldn't encourage, because it's not just engineers we need in this sector. We need lawyers.
Yes.
We need PR consultants. We need people with fantastic communication skills. So there's a huge range of skills that we need. But I've spoken to women in many sectors who are deeply frustrated with the fact that their employers are flying in people to give speeches and talks during International Women's Day and that kind of thing. And yet when they tried to apply for parents' leave, which they're legally entitled to, there were crazy barriers put in place. That kind of thing just rings so hollow, and it makes people think that it's all lip service. So I would love if we could lead the way on this, if the energy sector could become known as a sector where everybody is welcome, everybody's contribution is valued, and nobody is expected to work around the clock. I think that could be a really positive step for gender diversity in our field. And
it's a really interesting point, because I think sometimes for all the progress that we've made on gender diversity in the workplace and so on, you've got to continue to acknowledge that the whole workplace was constructed over hundreds of years, largely by men for men. And the kind of the reforming of that for a more equal workplace, it means we're going to end up ultimately with a very, very changed workplace, set of work practices, how work gets done, and I think what you're saying is, rather than just doing the pieces to attract young girls into the subjects that might be useful, but actually just change the environment to make it a more attractive environment for women to participate in more generally.
Exactly, yeah. The the current work practices were built up assuming that there was someone else looking after your house and kids all day long.
Yes.
And as long as we continue on that assumption, we're not going to attract not just women, but anyone with caring responsibilities or anyone with work-life balance priorities. We're going to be cutting those people off.
So the energy industry is a magnet for gender diversity on the basis of it being family friendly and giving people, and it's not just families, is it? It's just that flexibility, because I think women often just make different decisions about things than men do, and have a different value system in those decisions.
And maybe men would make those decisions as well if the culture was different.
If it was different.
Yeah. So it's win-win for everybody. I don't generally use that phrase, but there you go.
It's a no-brainer, Muireann.
It's a no-brainer.
And so maybe bring it to the concluding question of the podcast. It's a podcast about exploring the path to Ireland's energy future. And in a couple of sentences, if you were queen of the world and could change one or two things, what would they be?
So I think I would try to get systems-based thinking more ingrained. So rather than approaching things as one technology versus another and stacking technologies up against each other, I'd try to say, what's the optimal system that we're looking for? What does that look like? Mm-hmm. And then once you know what the optimal system is, then you can put in place the policies to support the transition.
Very good. Succinct as always, Muireann. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today on KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, where we discuss the practical things that we can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland as a major energy producer. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.